the ropes.
Iconic is a word that should be used sparingly, but it's hard to think of a better one to describe that poster of a pop star dressed as a highwayman with a white stripe painted across his face. And unless you've been living on Mars or are barely out of nappies, you won't need me to tell you the singer was Adam Ant. There was, quite simply, nobody else like him. Fast forward 20 years, and the man who dominated the pop scene in the early 80s, easily its brightest star, was a burned-out husk, locked in a mental home with people who, he said years later, wanted to be dead. Adam Ant, did you want to be dead at that time?
I think it wasn't really wanting to be dead. It was just I felt dead. I felt that I was encased in... It was like a sort of Dante-esque purgatory. It was worse than hell. I just can't describe how terrifying it was, you know, knowing that you are in control of your faculties and being told you're not.
Let's come back to that in a bit more detail during the course of the conversation. But let's go back to the early days of you becoming a pop star. You were born Stuart Goddard. Where did Adam Ant come from?
When I decided to go into music, I'd always, I think, been impressed by the change of names, things like Cliff Richard, and it was quite a commonplace to change yourself to something more, you know, Stuart and the Ants. The Ants was because of the Beatles, because I thought the Ants were good, and they were small and they could survive a nuclear disaster. And Adam, I wasn't shaped like your kind of Mick Jaggers. I was a bit more kind of, I was a groundsman, so I had a sort of gardener's physique.
Muscular.
Yeah, and I sort of thought Adam, the first man, and Ants, so Adam and the Ants. It just came out of that, pure and simple.
What was it at the time that made you want to be a performer?
Well, I suppose I was lucky. I was born in 54, so when I was growing up, my mum was listening to Dickie Valentine, later Elvis Presley, and the crooners. You know, she loved Johnny Holiday, and I remember Freddie Mills on these early TV shows, these kind of, you know, Pete Murray and Ready Steady Go later on, and I saw the first ever appearance of Rolling Stones. So really I was part of the television generation, so music was always in the home. There was Sinatra, of course. It was just wonderful. It was, and my mother worked for Paul McCartney, so I would go to Paul McCartney's house and take his dog for a walk. So I had a very, very blessed into the Beatles.
But your kind of music, your kind of performance could hardly have been more different from a crooner like Sinatra or indeed a group like the Beatles.
I remember I went to Saturday morning pictures in Swiss Cottage Odeon, because on a Saturday morning your mum and dad say, look, out, go away, get out, and then go to church on Sunday to get out even more, and I don't blame them. But I went to the Odeon Swiss Cottage and I saw the Duke wore jeans with Tommy Steele leaning on a Wurlitzer 1800. Yeah. And it just stuck right in my head. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. And then, of course, my mum and dad, being working people, the main thing they wanted to give me was an education. So I was a grammar school boy. I'm a meritocrat, and I had a grant. Very lucky. Kids don't have that now. But I had a grant, and I went to school, and I was like a fish out of water. And my mum was on welfare, so there were kind of 400 kids with blue tickets, and I had a pink ticket for, like, free school dinners. But, you know, that made me a bit hard. But music was always there. But I was also interested in art, and I was taught Latin and Greek, and I had to play rugby. So I had this kind of poor man's Tom Brown school days. I had a poor man, you know, the martyrs had boaters. But behind that, I'd be doing Latin homework, and down on the estate, there'd be the youth club where all my friends would go and dress up, and they'd be playing Marvin Gaye and all the Tamla stuff. So I was torn between the two. And then later on, when I went to art school, at Hornsey College of Art, I was in a band, Bazooka Joe and his Rhythm Hot Shots. We were like a Shine On Night-esque rock and roll band. I played the bass, started writing, and then I formed a band called the B-Sides, and then I saw the Sex Pistols, and I thought, if they can do it with 4 chords, I can, and I just took my opportunity.
So were you a punk rocker then? Is that how you describe yourself?
I'm from the... If someone says what generation you're from, I'm from the punk rock generation, but they call it post-punk.
But the punks obviously wanted to shock. And they succeeded in shocking, and that was the whole point of them, in a sense. What were you trying to do that? I mean, I was looking at a video of you last night with my youngest son, as it happens. He thought it was great, incidentally.
Thank you.
But it looked today fairly shocking. I mean, you were ripping your shirt off and, all that kind of stuff, and you looked very threatening. You looked, yeah, I suppose that's the word, really. You looked threatening. Was that the impression you were wanting to create?
No, I just wanted to play my music, play my songs, and the attitude, because of the sort of pogoing and spitting, when it became a sort of, when the papers got hold of it, they had to simplify it and make it all punks wear safety pins and they spit and they gob. So people, I'd be doing concerts and they'd turn up and they spit at me.
Who would spit at you?
The audience.
Really?
They spit at you and they throw bottles at your head, and they'd... someone threw an anchor at me once.
A ship's anchor?
Yeah, that was in Canada.
Not a very big one, I imagine.
No, it was a real one. It hit me right in the... It just hit me, it wrapped around my neck and bashed me in the face.
Goodness.
And
what happened? You didn't carry on, did you?
Oh, yeah. I got him. No, well, I got him.
What do you mean you got him?
I just went down the audience and said, did you... No, I didn't actually. I just hit him with it. But, I mean, it was a very violent time, There was always that element.
Let's go back to Adam and the Ants. When did Adam and the Ants come into existence then, and how?
1970. It was called the Ants around about 77. In late 79, 80, I met Malcolm. I knew Malcolm before, but he approached me. I was in a hotel in...
Malcolm McLaren, yeah.
Malcolm, because they'd seen the audience I had. We had a really great audience. They were like Mohicans and really fabulous audience. It was very tribal. And he met me and he talked to me and he said, well, look, if you give me £1,000, I'll be your manager, but you mustn't tell anyone. So I did a gig at the Electric Ball and got £1,000, and I gave it to him. And then he just mentored me and the band. They didn't know Malcolm McLaren from a racing driver. They thought it was a car. But Malcolm, I just listened with Malcolm. He said, do you want to be a pop star or do you want to be that? Because he's got two things. You've got muscles and you look good. And I said, well, I want to be on cornflakes packets. I've been banging away. I want
to be famous.
I want to be like T-Rex. And he said, well, you're going the wrong way about it, mate. He said, because everything I did was in black and white. He said, well, you've got to get colourful, be a bit heroic. And I chose pirates and Native Americans and
highwaymen.
And highwaymen. Put it together. And he stole the band. He took them and he formed Bow Wow Wow. And left me to it.
So your mentor, the man who made you what you were, or encouraged you to become what you became...
He was the catalyst to make me use my energies better.
But then he stole your band.
Yeah.
He sabotaged you.
Well, yeah.
But nonetheless, I say nonetheless, maybe the two are connected. You became a very big star indeed. You had some memorable hits, Prince Charming and Music. Stand and Deliver was obviously the biggest one, the one everybody remembers. What did that do to you, becoming as famous as you were?
Well, no one can prepare you for that. I was like, I love my work, I love performing. If we didn't perform, we didn't eat. So I looked forward to performing. That was the fun of it. And I had this idea for a very heroic character based on kind of Errol Flint, Clint Eastwood and Brando, very filmic influences, but cross it with that kind of Hammer horror colour. And then sort of that, the sort of films you see on a Sunday afternoon with, And I could storyboard it. I storyboarded it, met Mike Mansfield, he shot it, and Bob's Your Uncle, there it was, jumping through windows, and it was colourful and heroic and different. Because by that time, the punk scene had become very grey.
Yeah, exactly. God, it was certainly different. It made people, well, as I say, 30 years later, people will still remember those images.
Well, hopefully.
Well, there's no question about that. But now, during this period, what was your state of mind? What I'm not clear about, having read now quite a lot about you, is whether you have always had some sort of bipolar disease.
Well, I have a problem with the term bipolar disorder, so I don't think it means anything. If you list the people that are supposed to have bipolar, you've got Winston Churchill, obviously Van Gogh, Kurt Cobain, Coleridge, Oscar Wilde. So if I'm in that company, good. They make the living out of their creativity. That makes it a very delicate situation. Mine, I had 11 days off when I started working for Sony.
11 days off over what period?
Over about full 11 days from 1980 when I started through to when I went solo. In about 3 years, I had 11 days off. And I was working for 9%. I was exhausted because I'm from a working background where I couldn't believe my luck when I was starting to get paid for what I did. So I thought, I better keep at this because this is going to go tomorrow. I was not someone who thought, oh, yeah. And there was no one to say, I never heard the word no. I heard yes a lot. Just do one more interview. And what about that? Yes. What about another magazine? So with Adam and the Ants, I didn't get a chance to rehearse. I'd turn up on stage, do the show, and then it was like they'd set up 8 interviews a day. Like this, I'd have 8. Because, oh, you've got to do this and you've got to do that. And so they instill in you this feeling of competitiveness, and you have a chart every week telling you what number you are in the scheme of things. And I was selling real volumes of records. So there's a lot of money at stake. You're like a racehorse, and you've got about the lifespan of an athlete, and I approach my career like an athlete because Muhammad Ali was my hero, and athletes don't take drugs or drink or smoke or do drugs, and I never did.
You did sex instead, I read you had said.
I know. I had my kicks on stage and in private, in the tradition of most musicians. I think musicians are on the road. They're like sailors. Some of the women that I had liaisons with are still friends of mine. They have children. I know their children. I know... Because I think I'm grown up enough to be able to have a relationship with a woman after.
Right, so we're not talking about 5 women a night, or...
No. I mean, I think when you write a book... When my book, Stand and Deliver, was actually done when I was, let's say, incapacitated. I mean, I was half man, half biscuit. I didn't know where I was. And my journals were taken because I needed the money by a very nice man called Mal, who worked for a company and the publishers. And he kind of took over the editing, and they were presented in a certain way. They began the book with a suicide attempt. My journals do not. And I have since, in the second edition, edited out a lot of stuff because I wasn't really well enough to do it.
What was it that drove you to attempt suicide?
Well, the first time I was pretty much at... I got married. I was at Hornsey College of Art. And in those days... You had to kind of...
We're talking about now the...
This had been 73,
yeah.
70,
Early 70s,
77.
Yeah.
And I met a lady there called Carol. At that time, you really had to have sex with a girl, you had to get engaged. I was pretty old-fashioned anyway. And my mum and dad were quite happy for me to get married. We were art students. I was staying with her parents, which was a bit difficult. And, you know, we were intelligent enough about it. We said, look, it's not working, is it? Because we were really just friends, you know. And we very much... said, OK, let's split. And then, unfortunately, I got my first hit record. So I had a very big bill, because it was like, well, you want the divorce?
20 years. And the man who dominated the pop scene in the early 80s, easily its brightest star, was a burned-out husk, locked in a mental home with people who, he said years later, wanted to be dead. Adam, and did you want to be dead at that time?
I think it wasn't really wanting to be dead. It was just I felt dead. I felt that I was encased in... It was like a sort of Dante-esque purgatory. It was worse than hell. I just can't describe how terrifying it was, you know, knowing that you are in control of your faculties and being told you're not.
Let's come back to that in a bit more detail during the course of the conversation. But let's go back to the early days of you becoming a pop star. You were born Stuart Goddard. Where did Adam Ant come from?
When I decided to go into music, I'd always, I think, been impressed by the change of names, things like Cliff Richard, and it was quite a common place to change yourself to something more, you know, Stuart and the Ants. The Ants was because of the Beatles, because I thought the Ants were good, and they were small and they could survive a nuclear disaster. And Adam, I wasn't shaped like your kind of Mick Jaggers. I was a bit more kind of... I was a groundsman, so I had a sort of gardener's physique.
Muscular.
Yeah, and I sort of thought Adam, the first man, and Ant, so Adam and the Ants. It just came out of that, pure and simple.
What was it at the time that made you want to be a performer?
Well, I suppose I was lucky.
The ropes. Iconic is a word that should be used sparingly, but it's hard to think of a better one to describe that poster of a pop star dressed as a highwayman with a white stripe painted across his face. And unless you've been living on Mars or are barely out of nappies, you won't need me to tell you the singer was Adam Ant. There was, quite simply, nobody else like him. Fast forward